Most Americans don't know where their gasoline comes from. They don't know where their electricity originates. They don't know what minerals are inside their smartphones or what parts make their cars function. And that ignorance would be harmless, except that the President of the United States shares it. On March 13th, 2025, standing in the White House briefing room, Donald Trump made a declaration that revealed he understands America's economy about as well as someone who's never looked under the hood of a car understands an engine. We don't need their cars. We don't need their energy. We don't need their lumber. We don't need anything that they give. Those words weren't about China or Russia or Iran. They were about Canada, the country sharing a 5,525-mile border with America, the nation that's been the closest ally, the most reliable partner, the most integrated economy with the United States for over a century. And that statement, if anyone actually tried to implement it, would trigger economic collapse on a scale that would make your grandchildren ask how America destroyed itself so completely. So let me educate you on something your president apparently doesn't understand: how America actually works. What keeps the lights on, what keeps cars running, what keeps grocery stores stocked, what keeps factories operating. Because the gap between Trump's confident rhetoric and the actual physical reality of American infrastructure is so enormous that crossing it would be like jumping the Grand Canyon. You're not making it to the other side. Start with something simple. The gas in your car right now, today, as you're listening to this, 4.3 million barrels of crude oil are crossing from Canada into the United States. That happens every single day, not weekly, daily. 4.3 million barrels, representing 63% of all crude oil imports into America. Canada doesn't just lead, it dominates American oil imports by a margin so vast there's no comparison. Saudi Arabia, which most Americans probably imagine as the main oil source, provides less than half of what Canada does. Now, here's where this gets interesting and exposes the complete economic illiteracy of that statement. America is the world's largest oil producer. American wells pump out 13 million barrels daily. More than Saudi Arabia at 11 million, more than Russia at 10 million. So if America produces all this oil, why import 4.3 million barrels daily from Canada? Because oil isn't oil. Different crude types require different refining processes and infrastructure built specifically for them. American refineries throughout the Midwest and Gulf Coast were engineered decades ago to process heavy crude from Canadian oil sands. Thick, sulfur-rich crude requiring specialized processing equipment. American wells mostly produce light, sweet crude, which is great but chemically different. You cannot substitute one for the other without completely reconstructing the refinery at costs ranging from $2 to $5 billion per facility and timelines of 3 to 5 years. Marathon Petroleum's Robinson, Illinois refinery processes 206,000 barrels daily. Every single barrel comes from Canada. Not most, all. BP's Whiting refinery in Indiana processes 435,000 barrels daily of Canadian crude after a $4 billion upgrade specifically to handle it. 14 major American refineries depend on Canadian crude for over 75% of feedstock. Combined, they process over 3 million barrels daily. If Canadian supply stops, these facilities shut down completely. Not reduce production, shut down. You can't run equipment designed for heavy crude on light crude. What happens to your gas price? Energy economists across Stanford, MIT, and the Energy Information Administration have modeled this. Consensus 30 to 70 cents per gallon increase within 2 to 3 weeks, but that assumes calm markets. In reality, with panic buying and speculation, the spike would be faster and higher. For a family with 2 vehicles driving 15,000 miles annually each, that's an extra $1,800 to $2,500 per year just in gas. For trucking companies, for delivery services, for every business using vehicles, costs spike immediately and get passed to consumers through higher prices for everything transported. But crude oil is just chapter 1. Natural gas reveals even deeper dependency. The United States imports 8.5 billion cubic feet of natural gas from Canada every day. That represents roughly 95% of all pipeline gas imports. Almost every cubic foot crossing through pipelines comes from Canada. The infrastructure moving this gas, Systems like TransCanada, Alliance Pipeline, Vector Pipeline cost over $30 billion to build and were engineered around Canadian gas flowing south. New York and New England don't supplement with Canadian gas, they depend on it existentially. Boston Gas serves 860,000 customers. National Grid serves 3.6 million across New York and Massachusetts. During peak winter, when temperatures drop and heating runs constantly, Canadian gas supplies 40 to 60% of total system gas, not a supplement, essential for keeping homes heated. Consolidated Edison serving New York City with 1.1 million electric customers and 1.1 million gas customers depends heavily on Canadian supply during peak periods. When the polar vortex hit in January 2024 with temperatures at -10 degrees in parts of New England, Canadian gas prevented widespread blackouts and heating failures. ISO New England, the grid operator, stated clearly that without Canadian gas, they would have implemented rotating blackouts affecting millions. Seth Bloomsack, energy director at Penn State, is blunt. If Canadian gas were disrupted during winter peak, you'd see rolling blackouts across the Northeast within 48 to 72 hours. In sub-zero temperatures, those aren't inconvenient, they're deadly. Emergency rooms fill with hypothermia. Pipes freeze and burst. The regional economy shuts down. Then there's direct electricity imports. In 2024, the U.S. imported 48 billion kilowatt hours from Canada, enough to power roughly 4 million homes annually. About 85% is clean hydroelectric power from Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia. Renewable, emissions-free power that states like New York, Massachusetts, and Vermont purchase for climate strategies. New York alone imported 9 billion kilowatt hours in 2024. If that stops, replacing it means bringing old gas and oil plants back online, exactly what these states try to retire for climate goals. Emissions spike, air quality deteriorates, electricity prices increase, climate progress evaporates. Now let's discuss something you've never thought about: critical minerals. The U.S. Geological Survey identifies 50 minerals as critical to economic and national security. America is 100% import reliant on 12 of them, zero domestic production. For another 29, imports supply over half. Canada produces over 60 minerals, including 21 of those 50 critical ones. Canada also produces 10 of the 12 minerals NATO calls defense critical: potash. Canada controls roughly 30% of global production, the largest source on Earth. Saskatchewan alone produces 20 million metric tons annually. The U.S. imports approximately 90% of its potash, mostly from Canada. Potash is essential for fertilizer, providing potassium crops need. Without adequate potash, corn yields drop 30 to 50%, wheat falls 20 to 40%, soybeans crater. If Canadian potash were disrupted, American fertilizer production collapses as stockpiles run out. The American Farm Bureau estimated in 2023 that sustained potash shortage would reduce agricultural output by $40 to $60 billion annually. Food prices would spike 15 to 25% within a year. Uranium. Canada is the world's second largest producer after Kazakhstan, producing roughly 8,000 metric tons annually, about 13% of global supply. The U.S. has 93 operating nuclear reactors, providing 19.6% of total electricity. These reactors consumed approximately 41 million pounds of uranium in 2024. Domestic U.S. production was under 1 million pounds. The remaining 40 million came from imports, primarily Canada and Kazakhstan, but Kazakhstan is closely aligned with Russia. Given tensions with Russia, U.S. utilities have been trying to reduce Kazakhstani dependency and increase Canadian supply. If Canadian supply becomes unreliable, nuclear plants face crisis. They can't switch to Russian-influenced supply for security reasons. They'd reduce output or shut down. Losing 20% of electricity generation would cause blackouts, spike prices, force fossil fuel expansion with massive emissions increases. But here's what should alarm defense planners most: rare earth elements. The 17 metals essential for modern military technology. F-35 seconds require roughly 920 pounds of rare earths per aircraft. Each Virginia-class submarine uses approximately 9,000 pounds. Precision missiles, advanced radar, satellites, all depend on rare earths for critical components. China refines over 90% of the world's rare earths, a near monopoly more complete than OPEC ever achieved with oil. The Pentagon has spent over a decade trying to reduce this Chinese dependency. The strategy: partner with Canada and Australia to build North American processing capacity. Canada has substantial rare earth deposits. Mountain Pass Mine in California, the only significant American rare earth mine, ships ore to China for processing because there's no domestic capacity. The plan was building processing facilities in Canada and the US, creating secure supply independent of Chinese control. If the Canadian relationship collapses, this entire strategy falls apart. America remains dependent on China for materials essential to every advanced weapon. And this isn't theoretical. In April 2025, China restricted exports of gallium, germanium, antimony, tungsten, and graphite to the US. Just 5 materials. Ford halted production at Chicago assembly plant, building 250,000 vehicles annually because of shortages in rare earth magnets for electric power steering. Tesla faced disruptions at Fremont and Austin. GM warned some plants could face shutdowns within weeks. One brief restriction nearly stopped American auto production. Speaking of automotive, US-Canada auto integration isn't just deep, it's cellular. A single vehicle assembled in Detroit might cross the border 6, 7, 8 times during production. Let's trace a Ford F-150, America's best-selling vehicle. Aluminum sheet metal gets produced at Alcoa's Deschambault, Quebec facility. Ships to Michigan for stamping into panels at Sterling Heights. Stamped panels go back to Oakville, Ontario for initial body construction. Partial body returns to Dearborn Truck Plant. Meanwhile, engine built in Windsor, Ontario, crosses into Michigan for integration. Transmission from Livonia. Transmission gets added. Seats manufactured by Magna International in Canada get installed. Wheels and tires from Canadian facilities added at the end. This isn't inefficiency, it's ruthless optimization. Each facility specializes in processes where it's achieved maximum efficiency through decades of experience and billions in capital investment. Magna International, headquartered in Canada, is one of the world's largest auto suppliers with 175,000 employees. In 2024, Magna supplied $42 billion in components to American manufacturers. That's more than the GDP of 130 countries. Ontario alone supports 675,000 automotive jobs, mostly supplying American manufacturing. According to the Center for Automotive Research in Ann Arbor, approximately 450,000 American auto jobs depend directly on Canadian parts supply. Not cheap labor, Canada pays similar wages. Technical capabilities, specialized facilities, and production capacity that doesn't exist in the US. Linamar Corporation, based in Guelph, Ontario, manufactures precision engine components in highly specialized facilities. Their cylinder heads used in millions of American vehicles are produced in plants that took decades to optimize and billions to build. There's no American facility producing equivalent components at equivalent scale and quality. If Canadian supply disrupted, automakers couldn't call alternative suppliers. The alternative doesn't exist. Industry analysts use one phrase to describe this integration: you can't unscramble an egg. And this exists within the USMCA framework. The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement replacing NAFTA in 2020 was specifically negotiated to lock in integration. It requires 75% North American content for vehicles, up from 62.5% under NAFTA. It mandates specific percentages of high-wage labor. It includes enforcement for labor and environmental standards. This was a comprehensive framework for integrated manufacturing negotiated over 3 years. The entire agreement was designed around certainty. Companies made multi-billion-dollar investments based on assumptions this framework would remain stable. GM invested $1 billion in Michigan facilities and $1.3 billion in Ontario because of USMCA certainty. Ford announced $11 billion in investments across North America through 2025 based on USMCA stability. But when the president who negotiated USMCA threatens making Canada the 51st state, when he imposes tariffs violating the agreement, when he declares America doesn't need Canadian goods, certainty evaporates. Investment gets delayed or canceled. Companies develop contingency plans. Some explore moving to Mexico or Europe where political risk seems lower. Let me give you actual trade numbers. In 2024, the US imported $422 billion from Canada. America exported $348 billion to Canada. That's a goods deficit of $74 billion. But that's misleading. It doesn't include services where America runs substantial surplus. Including services, total deficit shrinks to $36 to $45 billion, and that $74 billion deficit isn't money given away. Americans receive $422 billion in value, energy keeping factories running, minerals and electronics, components building products, lumber constructing homes, real goods Americans need and voluntarily purchase. The president claims the deficit is $200 billion. He's stated this dozens of times. That number appears nowhere in official data. Not Census Bureau, not Statistics Canada, not USTR, not any credible source. It's inflated by roughly factor of 4, but even if accurate, trade deficits aren't inherently bad. Germany runs surpluses with nearly everyone. China runs massive surpluses. Trade balances reflect different economic structures, not winner and loser relationships, and dependency runs both ways. There are 86 international transmission lines connecting states to provinces. In 2024, Canada exported 48 billion kilowatt hours to the US. America exported 13 billion to Canada. Flows go both ways based on demand and capacity. When Texas faced catastrophic grid failure in February 2021, killing over 200 people and causing $195 billion damage, Canadian provinces offered emergency power. The interconnections saved lives. Right now, January 2026, trust collapses at alarming speed. Trump hasn't just suggested once that Canada become the 51st state, he repeats it consistently. He posts about annexation multiple times weekly. He refers to Prime Minister Mark Carney as Governor Carney, not as a slip, but as consistent policy. He posted AI-generated maps showing Canada, Greenland, Venezuela as American territory. At Davos in January 2026, he suggested America might use military force to acquire Greenland from Denmark, a NATO ally, making every ally wonder if territorial integrity means anything. Canadian public opinion hardened dramatically. Angus Reid Institute polling in December 2025 showed 90% oppose annexation, up from 82% in March. Ipsos polling found 82% would rather rejoin the British Commonwealth as a dominion than become American. Canadians would prefer going backwards 60 years to pre-independence status than joining the US. That's how strongly they value sovereignty. And it's unified across the political spectrum. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre stated, "Canada will never be the 51st state. Our sovereignty is not negotiable." Liberal Prime Minister Mark Carney told Trump directly, "Never, never, 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 never." NDP leader Jagmeet Singh said, "We will defend Canadian sovereignty by any means necessary." Provincial premiers from Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, all opposed. But damage is material and economic. Investment depends on certainty. Canadian business investment in the US fell 8.2% in first 9 months of 2025 versus 2024. American investment in Canada fell 7%. Combined, that's roughly $28 billion in investment. That didn't happen. And Canada actively diversifies trade. First 10 months of 2025, Canadian exports to the US fell 4.1%. That's $17 billion in trade. That didn't happen. Meanwhile, exports to European Union increased 8.3%. To Japan rose 11.2%. To South Korea jumped 15.7%. Prime Minister Carney visited China in November 2025 and signed expanded trade agreements, visited India in December and finalized comprehensive deals. These represent Canada's strategic decision to reduce dependence on an unpredictable partner. When 76% of your exports go to one customer who keeps threatening you, diversification isn't just smart, it's essential for survival. So let me be specific about what happens if America tries functioning without Canada. Within 1 week, gas prices spike 30 to 70 cents per gallon. 14 major refineries face shutdown. Natural gas prices in Northeast jump 25 to 40%. Within 2 weeks, rolling blackouts begin in New York and New England during peak demand. Auto plants in Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky slow production as parts inventory depletes. Defense contractors receive notices about rare earth shortages. Within 1 month, major automakers announce production halts. Vehicle prices spike as inventory depletes. Grocery prices begin rising as fertilizer costs affect agriculture. Within 3 months, agricultural yields decline as farmers reduce fertilizer application. Food prices increase 10 to 15%. Electronics manufacturers face component shortages. Smartphone production slows. Computer assembly delays. Within 6 months, nuclear plants begin reducing output as uranium inventory depletes. Coal and gas plants forced to increase generation, spiking emissions and prices. Defense production faces delays. F-35 deliveries fall behind schedule. And this happens while America simultaneously fights with China, threatens Europe, tries maintaining leadership. Every ally watches and recalculates their Washington relationship. If America treats Canada this way, what will they do to us? Trust erodes globally, not just bilaterally. The irony should be obvious. Declaring we don't need Canada while structurally depending on Canadian resources reveals not strength but ignorance. 4 million barrels daily says you need Canada. 8.5 billion cubic feet of gas daily says you need Canada. 675,000 integrated manufacturing jobs say you need Canada. Pentagon mineral strategy says you need Canada. Reality doesn't care about confident rhetoric. Reality is infrastructure built over decades that can't quickly change. Reality is supply chains optimized through billions in investment. Reality is dependencies existing whether acknowledged or not. When rhetoric collides with reality, reality wins. Always. Eventually. The only question is how much damage happens before that lesson sinks in. Most Americans don't know where their gasoline comes from. They don't know where their electricity originates. They don't know what minerals are in their phones. And apparently neither does their president. But ignorance doesn't change reality. It just makes the collision more painful. If this helped you understand what's actually at stake, not headlines, but real dependencies and consequences, hit subscribe and comment. Can this relationship be repaired, or are we watching North America fundamentally fragment? I genuinely want to know what you think.